Hello, this is Marilyn Hamilton, and we're back again with an interview from the balcony. And I'm so delighted to welcome back Nish Dubashia, and we're going to continue to explore the diamond model. Welcome, Nishad. How are you today?
Thank you very much. I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm well too. So it's a little bit further in the year past Valentine's Day. So diamonds have been on some people's mind, but maybe not the way that we've been talking about them.
Probably not quite the way we're going to use it now.
So this is our third interview in a series where we've been exploring spirituality in the city. And I shared in our earlier discussions how delighted I was to be introduced to your diamond model through your discussions with Peter Mary and your explorations of David Bohm and Krishnamurti and how you derived the diamond model. And I recognized in it, oh, I think this is actually the archetype of what I called my map 5, spirituality in the city. So after my enthusiastic introduction to it, I did a little bit of homework over Christmas and the New Year, and I went back and thought of a number of the basics of the framework of IntegralCity, I think, could be adapted to the diamond model. It's not simply the map 5 spirituality, but as we talk today, I may be able to share why I think that is so. But I thought that if that makes sense to you, then what I would like to do is invite you to just remind us what are the elements of the diamond model. And to do that, if you're okay, I'll share my screen. And then
that would be fine. Thank you. Yes.
We'll have an image of it. So here we go.
Great.
There we go. So on the screen, yeah, there's your good name and the name of the model. So take us through it just to remind us what's here.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is a model that came to me 3 decades ago, around about the time I was in discussion with David Bohm. And as a student of comparative religion and mysticism, my interest was and is to look at the different traditions, religious and mystical, and also to look at some of the findings of modern physics, which I was discussing with David Bohm, and to see what are, if any, the common elements that seem to pop up or arise everywhere, in every tradition, in every thinker, in modern physics, and to see if there's some kind of archetypal pattern that may be one way of looking at the underlying essence of what each of these traditions and teachings are pointing to. I wanted to do this with as few ideas or elements as possible, but enough to be able to cover what these commonalities genuinely were. And largely inspired by the work of David Bohm, the initial insight that I was able to draw upon was this distinction between multiplicity and fragmentation. So I'll start there when I'm talking about the model. That would be the easiest place to start, I think. So just 2 levels up from the bottom of the model, there is this word multiplicity, which basically means, the way that I'm using it, it's the world of separate things, of parts, of events, of things in 3-dimensional space and events in time. It's the usual world we live in, what we call the manifest world. Now, what David Bohm's great insight was, and this is mirrored in most of the spiritual traditions, is that this multiplicity arises out of a deeper wholeness, if you like, an underlying ocean of being that's not normally perceivable by us with our normal organs of perception. And this multiplicity arises historically and moment to moment out of this underlying whole, and in some sense returns to the whole again as we continue to evolve. But the problem one of the key problems that can arise in relation to this dynamic between the whole and multiplicity is that multiplicity can be taken too far. And what I mean by that is that parts can be created which are not really parts. Divisions can come in which are not really valid divisions. Or conversely, unities can be created that are not really unities. And when this happens, the realm of the parts, the multiplicity, in some way starts to divorce itself from its underlying wholeness. And we get what David Bohm referred to as fragmentation. So the parts become the fragments. A very simple example of this is the division of the human species into different races. Now, in some sense, for practical purposes, we can talk about different nations and different races. But when those divisions are taken far too seriously, and we lose sight of the underlying wholeness of humanity, the parts become the fragments, and that leads to obvious problems of racial tensions, racism, war, and so on. Religious differences are another very obvious example of that. So these are, in a way, the three main components of the model, the easiest to understand. You have the whole manifests as multiplicity. Multiplicity can be taken too far to produce fragmentation. Now, the interesting question is, how does the whole actually become multiplicity? How does the one become the many? And one of the clues to this that I found was in reading Taoism, the Tao Te Ching, where there's a verse in Lao Tzu where he says, and the zero becomes the one becomes the two becomes the three, and the three becomes the many. So that seemed to indicate that there was some kind of intermediate stage between the whole and multiplicity, between the one and the many, which he referred to as the two. So there was a splitting of the whole, an apparent splitting of the whole, I should say, from one into two, or what we can refer to as dualism. So there are many different ways to frame this dualism, but one of the ways that I have found the most useful is the subject and the object. So we can think of that in psychological terms, if we like, that we create a sense of self, a sense of an observer who is observing what we then come to believe is an objective world. And to some degree that has validity, but of course we can take it too seriously. And that later on can lead to fragmentation. So the whole emerges into this division between the subject and the object, and that process of division continues. So the subject has divided itself from the object, and then the subject continues to divide the object even further and divide itself internally even further to get this massive world of multiplicity. Now, the traditions, and even David Bohm and Krishnamurti, they talked about something beyond the whole, something even beyond the universal. And David Bohm refers to this as the ground. The traditions, I think, refer to this, or some of the traditions refer to this as the non-dual or non-dualism. So what the ground there really represents is the ultimate insight, or the ultimate state of affairs, which is that even wholeness and multiplicity are themselves not really separate in any ultimate sense, but that they are also really just parts or aspects of an even deeper wholeness, which we can refer to as the ground, or the non-dual, not two-ness of the whole of reality. Now, this process whereby the ground becomes the whole, becomes subject-object, becomes multiplicity, becomes fragmentation, which we can understand in many different ways historically in each moment, is called involution. That was a term that was popularized by Aurobindo, who is a great Hindu mystic. And the reverse process whereby we, and even the universe as a whole, rediscovers its underlying wholeness and the even deeper wholeness of the ground, we can refer to as evolution. So we have this endless cycle of involution, evolution, involution, evolution. And that cycle is the essence of this diamond model, and what I came to believe lies at the essence or the heart of many of the great traditions and teachings.
Beautiful.
And that's what I've referred to as the diamond model. But for two reasons. First of all, because part of the model resembles a diamond physically, but also because in Buddhism, I think in the Platform Sutra, the Buddha nature or the essence or truth of who we really are is also referred to as a diamond. So diamond can represent essence. So that's what this model is trying to convey.
Beautiful. Thank you, Nisha. It really helps to walk through it and appreciate it. Every time I encounter it, I appreciate it anew. I think it does, it kind of sparkles like a diamond, because I think you've achieved the essence of reducing it to, the essence parts, and yeah, just giving them the names, and it feels like you use the word archetype. It feels like a universal pattern, so feels quite comfortable. Thank you for giving us a reminder of the explanation. What I thought we could do today was to start a little bit where we left off the last time, where I was taking the diamond model and noticing, okay, how would this apply to what I call map 5 in the IntegralCity model? And a simple way for me to translate what you've just explained is to say, here is another version of that map with the terminology I use. So I say there is a ground of being. I call it love. And from unity, I say there's source, and multiplicity, I call it resource or coherence. And my splitting of source into multiplicity is, I say, place caring and place making. So I would say place caring is subjective and intersubjective, and place making is objective and interobjective. What you added to my understanding of the map is this fragmentation piece. So instead of coherence, if we fragment, then we actually produce incoherence. So we can't find a way to make things hang together. They're all bits and pieces and parts, as you mentioned. I have, like you, used the terminology of involution for the emergence of from source down through resource and coherence and incoherence, and evolution as the counter process returning to love and the ground of being. So in that respect, I was able to find an easy path, a map, coherence, if you like, between the diamond model and what I've called, here I called it map 5A. And I think the last time we also looked at a version of this that I call 5B, where I'm actually, everything is the same except in the resource integration. I've opened that up a little bit because I use the terminology of grace and place and space. And this is, like, in some respects also related to what Wilber calls the big three, beauty, truth, and goodness. And in my the article that I wrote on spirituality in the city, I've spent a lot of time trying to find out how they all fit together in a kind of like puzzle pieces. So what the diamond model helps me to see is, well, perhaps I don't need to be so granular, but if we do get granular down in here, we can see why it's intended to be an interpretation of the multiplicity. But what I hadn't taken into account was this disintegration, the lower part here. So that's what that helps to explain for me, is by adding the disintegration is why we feel incoherence or lack of integration in the city. It's the city as a human system at scale is so dynamic, it's so complex that most people can only see it through its bits and pieces and fragments. And it's so easy for us to lose sight of coherence. I think when our cities belonged to much more homogeneous societies, where belief systems all hung together as maybe one major belief system, like if it was in China and everyone was practicing Taoism, then we could all use the same language. But one of the features of modern large cities, especially I would say in the West, we have such a migration and immigration policy that most of our cities have all the belief systems in the world mixed up, and we haven't yet come to a place where there is coherence, where we can share our understandings. And so that's one of the reasons that your diamond model gives me hope, because I think you give us an opportunity where we might all notice the archetypal patterns that our different belief systems actually mirror, and that we could then have a conversation about it. Yeah.
Yes,
So does
yes.
that make sense to you? Do you think that's a possibility for the future?
Oh yes, I think so. I mean, I think first of all, the way you've found the correspondence is really inspiring and wonderful. And yes, I think a model such as this, or any comparable model where we look for commonalities, can indeed could in the future or even now help us to move from fragmentation to multiplicity, because we can see through this kind of understanding where that deeper wholeness may actually lie. And we can see that these fragments, what we think are fragments or what we've made fragments out of, are not really as separate and different as we think they are.
Yes, right. Yeah.
So it's a kind of an interesting, almost an irony here, which is that the model is part of the model. The diamond model can itself be a tool to move from fragmentation to multiplicity within the model.
Yes, yes. I think that's a very elegant aspect of it. Yeah, so I always say, a lot of the conversations in the integral world are focused on transformation. And I always point out to people, actually what our big challenge is translation, is trying to understand what we're each talking about with different levels of complexity or different terminologies or different taxonomies. And that's why discovering an archetype that can give us a common language is really a beautiful opportunity. So,
yes.
So what I had wanted to do, Nishad, today was to go beyond this and say, okay, I went further because besides the 5 maps in IntegralCity, there are some other elements of the framework. And I think the diamond model helps to situate them as well. So I went ahead and made some more pictures of this. If you're okay, then I think I'll just start out with the master code of care, and let's see how that starts to unpack itself. Would that work for you? Okay.
Yes, that would work. Yes.
So in my first book, the very last chapter I wrote was about the evolutionary intelligence. And I think about the evolutionary intelligence as an evolutionary impulse that flows through the field. And I think that it has a calling to us, that I've used the word care so that we can understand that what this calling of the evolutionary impulse is, that we learn to care for ourselves so that we can care for each other, and together we can care for our places, and all together we can care for the planet. So it's like nesting these circles of compassion, or greater and greater capacities to care, right out to the size of our planet. So does that make sense to you, just as a starting point?
Yes. Oh yes, very much so.
Yeah. Okay, great. So then I came back to let's look at each one of these scales that are nested in the Master Code of Care and see whether, in fact, we can unpack them into the diamond model. So the first one I start with is the self. So, so love and the ground of being still is our starting point, or at least it's the deep starting point. Out of that emerges source and unity. And I'm going down to say that the multiplicity here is beauty. One of the comments that people often make about the world is there's just an infinite array of manifestations of beauty, whether we look at nature, whether we look at human-made art, whether we look at all the fractal designs that we're surrounded with. So beauty is a beautiful multiplicity that flows through our lives if we have eyes to see it, ears to hear it, all of our senses. And so if we go back and see what are the intermediate points where they go into two, I would say we could call one inner and the other outer. So there's inner beauty. We might be talking about character or compassion or kindness. We could also talk about how we express that not only as an individual, but as a collective. And then there's outer beauty, where we could see, as I said, it could be, clothing, it could be the ways that that rock wall I'm looking at is fitted together, or the beauty of an animal as it's walking along. So there's so many ways that we can see the world has both inner and outer beauty. If we looked at the ways that this kind of multiplicity could become fragmented, then I would say I'm going to use the word ugliness is what emerges. So this ugliness could even be, if we're just here looking at the Master Code of Care, looking at the self, it could be an unwillingness to really express care for self in a way that recognizes the beauty of life. So this is the first part of the Master Code of Care. It's also on this involutionary and evolutionary mode. So I think that we would recognize that the Master Code of Care goes through, stages of development as we mature. And so we become more or less able to even recognize the essence of our inner beauty and outer beauty. How does that fit with?
Yes, I like it. It's fascinating and illuminating. A couple of points we could maybe explore a little bit. Mm-hmm. Could we elaborate a little bit on why the Master Code of Care, which is the self, you're referring to self as one of those. How does self relate to beauty? Where is that correlation coming from? Is it because maybe self refers to, you're looking at the subjective dimension of life, and beauty in some sense is a subjectively experienced phenomenon? Is that one way of looking at this?
Yes, that is one way of looking at it. And it's, again, going back to what Wilber called the big three: beauty, truth, and goodness. Right. And so yes. How to situate those in an integral model, which of the quadrants holds those? And he sort of breaks away from the quadrants and says, beauty is, as you pointed, he tends to put it in the subjective, goodness in the intersubjective, and truth is the right-hand quadrant. So we have I, we, it, its. So I just borrowed that. And I'm not, I think an argument could be made for putting truth or goodness in there with the self as well. I haven't, because I've been playing with this. So I'm not fixed on it, but to respond to your question, that's why I chose beauty.
Okay, that makes sense. And the second point to just briefly explore is the intermediate stage between inner and outer, as our version of subject and object here in this context. The way inner and outer could relate to beauty. I mean, you talked about inner beauty and outer beauty.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, another possible way of looking at this also might be that it's when we make some kind of distinction between the inner and the outer in our own perception, it is necessary before we can start perceiving things as beautiful, because it's the inner that looks at the outer, if you like, and then recognizes something as beautiful. You need that distinction before you can see beauty as opposed to ugliness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that sort of goes back to that, the aware, who is aware and what are they
Yes.
aware of? Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Sure. So
Great.
let's,
Yes.
I think we'll have probably a similar discussion when we look at each of the elements of the master code. So
Yes.
now we're moving from the self to the others. So one must learn to care for others. So we start with the ground of being. We're still source as a unity. And our multiplicity here I put as truth.
Right.
And the reason I chose that was because when we're looking at this aspect, others, we can see individual and we can see collective. And
Right.
we're trying to align around that which brings them together in truth. And I'm putting the fragmentation as lies or falsehood, you know. And interestingly enough, since we've just lived through some really traumatic political times in the world, lies and falsehood have become a real challenge in the fragmentation of our world. And I don't think it's easy for us to find how do we reconcile that. Can we actually point to something and say it has an objective falseness to it that can be proved beyond a shadow of a doubt? Whereas if we maybe hold it within the diamond model, we can see what we're grappling with is fragmentation as opposed to multiplicity.
Right. Yes. 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 So yes. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes. So yes. Again, I can see the correlation clearly here between the objective domain and truth, in contrast to what we saw before, which was the subjective domain and beauty. And yes, the individual collective dualism there, I think that's a very interesting and apt lead up, if you like, via involution to reach the domain of truth. Because if we're talking in terms of objective truth, if that's what we want to be focusing on here, then truth is not true only for the individual, but it has to be true for the collective as well. The whole point of objectivity is that it goes beyond just my own individual perception.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be an individual and a collective component to it.
Yeah, and
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I actually have chosen the right one. We'll come and have a look at where I've situated goodness. But as I said, I was playing with these, so I'm not necessarily like, oh yes, I've landed and there's never going to be any movement here. And maybe they're they're actually holographic. So we have to not only look at this in a flat diamond model, but think about it in the field and how those might be shape shifting. If you remember when I did the 5 maps, I realized that I had to animate them in order for them to really cross-inform one another. Yeah, so maybe the same kind of thing would happen here.
Yes.
Okay.
I think so, yes. I think these are wonderful formulations, but I think, yeah, like you've just said, that there's a fluidity between the different components and even within the different quadrants here.
Yeah.
As to how we can depict this and show this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on and see master code of care. We've looked at self and others. Now let's look at place. So I use the word place to sort of hold what I mean about cities and their ecoregions. And for a lot of people, it makes it easier to think, okay, she's probably going to include villages, but place could also be a megalopolis as well. So here we start to look at the from the ground of being, source and unity again. And here I put the multiplicity as goodness. Now, I think there's an argument to be made that it could have gone to the previous one, you know, the one that I was looking at for others. Maybe goodness belongs there and truth belongs here. Anyway, here I've got the multiplicity of goodness coming through place, care, and place, make, and that out of the fragmentation from the multiplicity of goodness, I've just said is wickedness. It's just using the English sort of opposite of what is good, opposite of good,
right.
as wickedness.
Yes.
And it's kind of, maybe that harks back to, I think, a comment you made when you were talking with Peter, and you were looking at, I think, probably Christianity, and you were talking about the fragmentation there was sin.
Yes.
The multiplicity got fragmented into this disconnection from the whole. That was what it was, if I'm remembering correctly. You're cast out of heaven, cast out of the Garden of Eden, and for your wicked ways, for making bad choices.
Yes. 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 I think, I mean, Christianity largely seems to focus on the lower left quadrant. So it sees things very much in moral terms, in a way that, say, the Eastern traditions may tend to see things more in ontological, cosmic terms.
Yeah.
So yes, the contrast here between goodness and wickedness, or good and evil, is maps very well onto multiplicity and fragmentation in this context.
Yeah, and the question I have is going back to the prior one. Maybe these should be flipped. Maybe truth and lies belongs in this one around place, and goodness and wickedness belongs with the others. We'll see in a minute. I'm keeping my conclusions open here. So then we come to the fourth scale of the master code, and that's planet. So thinking in such grand terms, it's maybe easier to see source. Unity, I even say, is Gaia, what we call Gaia. And
right. Yes.
that the multiplicity, I say, is Gaia's reflective organ system. And this comes from my interpretation of James Lovelock, who says that humans have actually been evolved by Gaia to be her reflective organs. And I thought, oh no, I think it's the cities that are the organs. Organizations are like organelles, and individuals are like cells in those organs. So I've gone into a fractal interpretation of what he means. And so in order to think of this in terms of the planet, then it's kind of like going back to the self. Earlier, I'm saying that on the individual side, there's the city, one city, and then on the collective side of cities, there's a whole planet of cities. So if we were as a whole organ system in service to the life of Gaia, then what would happen if we were a lot like we are right now, which would be disunity. So there would be lots of fragmentation in our attempts to find ways to connect cities together, or even regions of cities together. Yeah, so this is just a very big picture of taking that individual scale right up to the planet.
Yes, great. This one actually is great, perfect.
Great. Okay, so then the accountant in me said, okay, let's see what it looks like if we put this on an integral map.
Right.
So here it's, let me see if I can get this a little bit bigger. There we go. So we have, so I've used the quadrants. So, you know, the master code of care has come out of my surmising, as I said, the kind of, how does the evolutionary impulse call us to align? And I after I had surmised the self, others, place, and planet, I took them and put them in the quadrants. So self was subjective, upper left. Others was intersubjective, lower left. Place was an it out there, objective, upper right, and the planet was the larger it. And so it's lower right. So then just taking small versions of those diamond models, I've just put them together here. And now that I see them this way, I really do think I would swap the goodness and the wickedness over to the others and move the truth and the falsehood over to here.
Yes, that would make sense. Yes.
I think that would make more sense. Yeah.
Yes.
But you could also see what I was, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's fascinating to see 4 versions of the diamond model all together at the same time across the quadrants. It's yeah, just fascinating to see that. We're taking it to another level now, I think, by seeing it in this way.
Well, the other thing was that I drew the arrows in because as I speak to people about this, and as my own career has been coaching and supporting the development of individuals and leaders and teams and organizations and sectors and communities, and then now working with cities and clusters of cities and regions and holding the intention for the whole planet, then I think that this is the arrows indicate a sequence of sort of capacity building.
Right.
When I tell people about, you know, the master code of care, we all experience it if we get a chance to fly, which many of us don't. Most of us don't these days. But the example there is they always give us the instruction that if the air mask drops, the first person to put it on is ourselves, so that we are able to care enough for our own well-being that we can help others. If we don't care for ourselves, then we're not available to help others. And the same rule, I think, applies to the care, master code of care. You start by learning how to care for yourself, then you are able to care for others, and then together we can care for our places, and altogether we care for our planet. So you're kind of building up the scale, but you're also building up capacity.
Right.
And I think that one of the things the diamond model gives us is, I've been trying to write a piece that addresses healing and trauma. And one of the values, great values of the diamond model, I think, is that we can see that the disconnections and trauma arise when we move from multiplicity to fragmentation. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, 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 and also I very much I can agree with the way you've shown them these blue arrows as a development of capacity. Another way to describe it is we're moving from first person to second person to third person to fourth person perspective.
Yeah, that's a nice way to frame it too. First to second to third to fourth. Yeah.
And that's of course a growth in capacity as we develop to be able to do that. Even in spiral dynamics language, it's we can say it's a movement from red to blue to orange to green.
Yes, and I think even in terms of learning, we can go from first loop second loop, third loop, and fourth loop learning too.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
There are parallels in Piaget's
Yeah.
developmental scheme as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, so now I have my homework to revise that Master Code of Care, that swap over the truth and the goodness. So then this next one is actually attempting to locate all maps within the diamond model. And I'll just show the overview here, and then I'll go back and look at what are those maps so that people can see that. So our ground of being, our source and unity, same. And I say that everything that we've been talking about in our map 5 is the resource and the integration. So that pulls the multiplicity into the elements of map 5. And that on the inner plane, I think that's map 1, which is basically the quadrants. And then the outer is the other 3 maps, maps 2, 3, and 4, where I try to make sense of the dynamics and shape-shifting forms of those maps. And that when they're not simply an integrated multiplicity, they become incoherent. And that's honestly why most people avoid, I think, talking about the city. It's too dynamic for them, and it's too, they can't see the patterns. Whereas I think that the maps I've developed, each one of them shows wholeness in a different way.
Right. Yes.
So if you're up to it, I'll go back to look at those maps.
Yes.
Yeah. So here, this is the left-hand side. I'm saying here's the inner map. This is map 1, and it shows us those realities that we know from the sort of classic integral model. And as I point out, this is, I think, a refinement that Don Beck brought, which was that the evolutionary impulse is at the center here. You know, Wilbur points out this is tetra arising, everything's arising all at once. But what is impelling this motion outwards, this movement towards greater and greater either circles of compassion or the Master Code of Care, or just this evolutionary impulse to grow. It's there, it's at the center, and it's always pulsing, I think.
Yes, yes.
And so then the maps 2, 3, and 4, they're all different pictures of, here's the holarchies, map 2, which is showing the stacks of individual family groups, organizations, communities, cities, ecoregion that are existing on the planet. So that's the holarchy. We call that a natural hierarchy of scales there. And they're all the relationships. And I often say this is the one that shows us sort of my simple Master Code of Care, why and how we're connected with one another, and so it's natural that if we don't care for ourselves, we're going to have ripple effects to all the other cares we're trying to do.
Right.
And then map 3 is really a way of parsing out map 1. So I've taken all those developmental levels and shown, as we're in each sort of stage where our world is more or less defined by our values about what world we're able to view, and how we're able to reach out and relate to others, as well as the objective world. I haven't put the 4 quadrants in here because it gets pretty messy when you're using patterns, but this is what the intention is. Here's a highly developed individual leader. So I'm saying this is what you can notice from their behavior on the outside, even as you know from having looked at the earlier map, that's matched rather by the development on the inside.
Right.
And then I show them in relation to others who are a highly developed team, like this could be a sports team or an organizational development team, and how they then go work with organizations and agencies who have a variety of different capacities expressed in their behaviors and systems. And then altogether, when we look at them as a city, then we see every level and combination and permutation.
Right.
And we could easily say, okay, there, the argument for fragmentation is right there. But at the same time, we could also say, yes, but this is also multiplicity. This is how gardens grow. And so it's an ecology of capacities.
Right. Right. Yes. So multiplicity, the many, doesn't necessarily imply fragmentation. It's possible for there to be a harmonious many.
Yeah, and I think, if you speak to people who work not only the development of adults, but you mentioned Piaget, and if you look at childhood development, then you don't say that the system is broken or fragmented when it's going through its multiple stages and naturally progressing, as I said, within an ecology of others. So that's the maps 2 and 3. And then map 4 is quite clearly a picture of the archetypal shapes and structures of organizations. So they're the ways that we organize our multiple people, and even will build our architectures, and the buildings that hold these organizations will have some kinds of reflection of how these structures have emerged. Here I've got them in the spiral dynamic sequence over time, from the least complex level of the family hearth to the most complex level of the globe.
Yes.
So those are clearly, I would say, it's and belong on that along with the other cluster of maps that I had put on the external group.
Yes.
When we were looking at the maps.
Also, when you mentioned map 2, the concentric circles.
Yes.
The extended scope of compassion.
Yes.
That also reminded me of the development from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to cosmocentric.
Yes.
Which are effectively 4 concentric circles, and we can see that in the other developmental maps there that you've used as well.
Yeah. So one could also say there's an argument here that, well, all those maps that I'm showing as outer here, they all have inner aspects to them. And also that map 1 has clearly the left-hand quadrants, which are internal, and the right-hand quadrants, which are external. But I was just, as I said, saying, playing with, okay, can the frameworks be given some greater understanding or relationship to one another within the diamond model?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, fascinating.
And so I would say, after showing this one, the proper thing to do would to bring out that animation of all those maps and say, okay, well, here it is. Right. The animation is actually flowing through the diamond model. And in fact, it begins and ends with the ground of being, that animation.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So what's the last one I have here? Oh, no, it's not even the last one. It's the second last one. So now I looked at the bees. So why do I look at the bees? And that's because that's the biomimicry lessons that I learned about the roles within the hive, and that I talk about within the city as being the voices. And they all do work together as a whole. And there is something, a role that these were originally learned from the work of Howard Bloom, and in his book, The Global Brain. And he was originally an entomologist, so he knew these things about bees and ants, and he started working with one of the big 60s rock and roll bands and started to observe people. And he said, I've seen these behaviors before, and I think I saw them in the beehives.
Right.
So he said, the majority of the hive and the majority of the people I watch, he would call conformity enforcers. So in the beehive, they're the ones that gather most of the pollen and nectar.
Right.
They would probably be about 90% of the hive. About 5% of the hive, he called them diversity generators. They would go and also forage, but their job was always to find and locate resources in different places than the conformity enforcers. So that meant when they came back to the hive, they did different waggle dances and gave different information for this role of the multiplicity manager, which he called the resource allocator. So I said, okay, the resource allocator is saying, how are we going to achieve the goal that we know this hive needs to achieve, and that is to produce 20 kilograms of honey a year, or we won't survive. So in Bloom's, when he wrote that book, he called the fourth role, the integrator. He actually called it the hive, inner judge. He called it the inner judge. But since then, we've come to know a lot more about bees, and we even talk about a hive mind. And so, but the role is to work with the resource allocator and the whole hive to see, are we achieving our purpose to sustain not only ourselves internally, but bees also pollinate the ecoregion. So as a life system, they're enormously valuable to every ecoregion they're in, and in fact produce something like $90 billion worth of food every year for us humans.
Right.
So if we look at the diamond model and put these roles on it, we could see that if we don't have a multiplicity manager, the resource allocator, then we would disintegrate. Then we would basically not achieve our goal. And that means that we don't get to survive. We don't survive for the value of the hive, and we stop our capacity to pollinate. So there's a whole ecological reason, if you want to say, even the master code of care, I track through the bees because they look after individuals, the hive, everybody in their different roles. They're constantly, they train each other, and they care for the hive as a whole, and they care, of course, for their ecoregion, the place on the planet.
Right.
So I don't know how much of a stretch that is for you to take the diamond model and to apply it even to a non-human species.
No, I see no reason why not. I think if it's truly universal, we should be able to apply it almost anywhere, and that does make sense what you've said. Can you just elaborate a tiny little bit again on the whole hive mind integrator? Is that an individual, or are you talking about like a collective intelligence there?
Well, when I first read what Bloom wrote, he said, well, about 3% of the hive is the resource allocators and the inner judges.
Okay.
So he was putting some numbers to it then. However, I've gone on and read a fair amount of research about bees. And so now there's a sense that the whole hive has a sense of itself. It's like a collective consciousness for the hive.
Right.
So I named it here a whole hive mind. And when I work with cities, these roles, I convert them into the voices. And I say, the whole hive mind is really the voice of the integrator. And in the city, here, I've got it here, in the city, I would even probably give that role to civil society. I've got the voices here, and again, I might redraw this slide. So here I've got the conformity enforcers are like our citizens, and the diversity generators are like our business innovators. They're also like civic managers. So I have said when I was looking at city voices that the role of civil society, I think, is one that is a unifying one. Right. So it tends to say to others, look, we haven't looked after the marginalized, or what is the purpose of doing this, or has a much bigger picture than just collecting taxes and fixing potholes. It has a sense of the whole. So again, I might even choose to redraw these voices in a slightly different way.
Yes, that makes sense. I mean, if the organizing role, if you like, is being given to the subject, if you like,
Yes.
Then that frees up the wholeness aspect of the model for the possibility of a collective consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah, and the interesting thing about thinking about this is I do think for human systems, new governance will come from cities. I think it'll come from the relationships between these voices. I think it has already come from that, and that you could historically look at how governance has become more and more complex and more participatory, more able to be mindful not just of ego and ethno considerations, but widening it out to world and even cosmic considerations.
Right.
But what we mostly concentrate on is because we have such poor ways of handling multiplicity, we just get stuck on the fragmentation, and then that's just noise and cacophony.
Yes, yes. And really the only way to truly handle multiplicity and not allow it to fall into fragmentation is by grounding that multiplicity in the whole. We can't merely we can't merely do things at the level of multiplicity alone, because then it will naturally become fragmentation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bees have been around for 100 million years, and they figured this out.
Yeah. Yes.
They do work to this purpose for the hive, and the one of the propositions I have to cities is, I truly believe that every city has a purpose in service to Gaia. Just most cities haven't figured out what it is yet, and it's not all the same. Just like we have different organs in different locations in our bodies, Gaia has her organs located strategically as well, and she's waiting for us to wake up and grow up and put them in service to her, I think.
So you're seeing the city as, if you like, the holons that make up the larger holon of Gaia.
Yes, and they need something like the diamond model to show that they're social holons. They're not monads. So
got you.
And so
this was going to be my question, which is that if we see a city as a holon, then what is the dominant monad? But there isn't one because it's a social rather than an individual holon.
That's it. It's a social holon.
Okay.
And a lot of people get stuck on that. And in fact, when I first started to work with the integral model, I saw the city as kind of like monad. And then very quickly I realized, no, social holon. I had enough of people like Barrett Brown and Sean Esper Harkin saying, Marilyn, look at what you really mean as a social holon. And I realized, very quickly, well, that makes all the difference. But it doesn't, quote, excuse us or let us off the hook of trying to find this coherence to enable emergence. And it doesn't give us excuses for not being able to resolve the fragmentation.
Right. Oh, yes, I agree, because one of the key insights of the integral model is that the social aspect has a relative independence from the individual aspect. We can't merely reduce the social holon merely to individual holons. It has its own independent existence, if you like, and it has to be dealt with in that context. So we have to deal with the city as a holon in its own right.
Yeah, and that's why the bees have been really instructive for me, because they're also a social holon, right?
Okay.
But as a species who's had 100 million years and a much shorter life cycle to experiment and survive, they figured out how they need to go through their life cycle, how they need to specialize their jobs, how they coordinate that together, how they produce something that has value not only to them, but to all the other species in their ecoregion. So like they actually create renewable energy for next year. That's what happens when they pollinate. And my question has always been, so what is the equivalent of 20 pounds of honey for the human hive? If we can answer that, and I'm not just talking about the energy supply, yes, that too we have to find out, but how will that cause us to discover why Gaia has evolved us as reflective organs?
Right.
If maybe we could say the bees' pollinations was the service to Gaia, what does she need reflective organs for? Well, apparently for something, and we better figure out what it is.
Right. In other words, what is the real human service to Gaia meant to be?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the very last experiment I did with your diamond model is I went to the GPS, which is the model that I created from the 12 intelligences that I wrote about in the first book. So I've organized all the intelligences in this model of the whole. So there's our whole. That has come to be called the GPS. And in that we have inner consciousness of the individual. You can see that in the inner integral frame here. If we made it bigger, we could see it. Inner. And then there's also the outer cultural systems and collective here. So we've got inner, both in this side, I'm keeping the individual on this side like we did in the earlier example in the diamond model. And over here are collective cultural systems. So inner on one side, collective on individual on one side, collective on the other. And then for the whole, I said the evolutionary intelligence, which there I've got it sitting right in the center, because just like in map 1, that's the impulse that's really growing all the other intelligences. And then the two outer rings, I call them contexting and strategic. So the strategic ring is inquiry and meshworking and navigating. And then the contexting ring is the the emergent, the integral, and the living intelligences. So I just have mapped them onto the diamond model, and basically said that those contexting and strategic sets of intelligence are how we manage our multiplicity. And when we don't do that very well, we become incoherent and fragmented.
Right.
When we do it well, we get to evolve and be of service to Gaia.
Right. Yes, brilliant. This makes total sense to me.
You're very generous.
I mean, for me, it's actually great, because when I first created this model, it was my main interest was comparative religion. That's my kind of specialist area. And it's wonderful to see it being applied to completely different areas, because that gives me confidence that this is something that could be important, because it can have an application in many different areas. And it truly points to the unity of everything. That really, all these different fields are really just aspects of the same field, which is human living.
Yeah. Well, and I like it because it doesn't feel reductionistic.
No.
It feels like it has a lot of life in it, and it doesn't, to me, privilege or prejudice any particular practice.
Right.
You can. It's like being able to admire the mystery and magic of archetypes and
Yes.
universal patterns, and they're so amazing because they tend to be at all scales, from microscopic to macroscopic,
Yes.
and I feel that it captures it. Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking now that the diamond model, one way we could understand it is that it shows the structure of the holon, because every example we're looking at of the diamond model, every application, in a way, it's a holon. It's something that's made up of parts and which is a part of a greater whole. So I'm wondering if any holon at all that we can find in any of the 4 quadrants, if we look at the architecture of the holon, it can be shown, it can be represented with the diamond model.
Maybe.
So that would be interesting, and in the context of the integral city, that's one of the things I'm seeing as you're showing all these patterns.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So I think you're just setting up another conversation or two.
Great. Wonderful. I wanted also, you asked me a brilliant question last time, which I don't think I answered as well as I could have done. And it got me thinking, and I've been thinking about it a lot since our last conversation, which is, if you remember, you asked me, how does the ground become the whole? Do you remember you asked me that? Could I spend 2 minutes and just address that?
Sure, that would be wonderful.
Could you bring up the diamond model again?
Yes.
And I think it relates very well to all of these examples that you've shown in the integral city as well.
There we go.
Great, because what has occurred to me, what is happening here is that when the ground becomes the whole, that's a way of talking about it. The ground becomes the whole, and then the whole becomes multiplicity. If we see those as the 2 primary emergences that are going on here, then I think at each of those stages, what's actually being introduced is a particular dualism. So the obvious one is when the whole becomes the multiplicity, the dualism that's being introduced in order to make that possible is the dualism between subject and object, or between interior and exterior. I think there's a much more subtle dualism that's being introduced when the ground becomes the whole, which is the dualism between the individual and the collective. The reason I say that is because think of what the ground actually represents. It represents the non-dualism between the whole and multiplicity. So prior to that dualism between the whole and multiplicity, what you have is, in order to create that dualism between the whole and multiplicity, what you're actually doing is creating a distinction between the individual, which is the whole, and the collective, which is multiplicity. So these are the 2 primary dualisms that are emerging as we move from the ground to the whole and the whole to multiplicity. And what's interesting there is we've actually created the 4 quadrants by doing that. The ground becomes the whole. You've got your upper quadrants and lower quadrants. And then when the whole becomes multiplicity, you've got your left-hand quadrants and the right-hand quadrants.
Beautiful, yeah.
So by the time you get down to multiplicity, as you've shown in your earlier diagrams, you've got all 4 quadrants at that level. But the way the quadrants emerged was through these 2 stages, if you like, from ground to whole and then whole to multiplicity.
That's really beautiful, and I would guess that Wilbur would find that satisfying too, because his discovery of the quadrants was from immersing himself in the world's discourses, right, and philosophies, and just literally laying them out on his floor because he had all the books, and until he noticed the pattern. And I was speaking to somebody earlier today on another topic. Actually, somebody who had written a book called the Turquoise Brick Roads. They were looking at the turquoise, what it means to start thinking in turquoise, and they'd done a very nice illustrated book, and that was accessible to many people. And I was saying, one of the things I've noticed about these patterns, because I've had the privilege to supervise enough master's and doctoral theses, you don't need to impose them on the data.
Mm.
The data emerges them from itself because they're
Exactly.
universal. And I think that your explanation here is a way of saying it's going to turn up.
Yes.
So it turns up because it's embedded in life, reality, non-dualism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is fascinating because I've just been having this kind of conversation on Facebook with Corey DeVos.
Oh, yes, I know Corey.
Yes, and what we were discussing, and there was another person on the discussion as well, is the integral model and these kind of models, are these just eclectic? I mean, are we just arbitrarily putting things together to create nice, pretty patterns? Or is there something inherent in these connections? And what we started to realize was that actually when the mind it develops to second tier cognition, these connections, if you like, present themselves rather than us creating them arbitrarily. In a very general kind of sense, these connections were already there, but simply we didn't recognize them when we were operating at first tier cognition.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these basic patterns are recognized by us rather than created by us. And that's why it's not merely eclectic.
Yeah, I would agree too. And as I said, it was fascinating for me as a supervisor to restrain from saying, "Oh, I could really help you make sense of this." But I made that as an ethic for myself. My role was to coach and support this emerging learning, and it happened so frequently. I thought, oh, I just need to lean into the natural emergence that will come and just hold the space for them to make the discovery. And I saw it again and again with very different people, different discourses and explorations. So yeah,
Yes,
I agree with you. And I think that also speaks to David Bohm's implicate explicit order.
Oh yes,
as I understand it, right? That's why it's possible. It is there. Yeah.
Yes, these are underlying archetypes that emerge out of the implicate order. Yes.
Well, Nishad, I can think of at least a couple of more conversations I'd love to have with you, because some of the people I'm starting to connect now with cities in the UK, and some of my contacts are telling me, well, we're getting participatory communities or groups who want to get together, and they're coming out of the multi-faith community. So if that's the case, it would be very interesting, I think, for us to have a conversation that might involve the possibility of representatives from the multi-faith community. Yeah.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Yes.
And to see.
Let's work towards that.
Is to see how opening that door would really be valuable for bringing coherence to the city. Yeah, I can even think of another a couple of locations with the Unity Peace Conferences coming up that this might be a perfect conversation to have.
Oh, okay. Great. Yes, I'd be very interested in that.
So thanks so much for joining me on the balcony and we needed a balcony to look down on all these patterns and even help me to see, okay, yes, I need a little bit more homework on a few of them, and I'll revise them and send them to you.
Great. And yeah, thank you again for your interest, or the interest you've shown in the diamond model. It's been wonderful talking to you. And let's talk again before too long.
Okay, thanks, Nishad. Bye for now.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you. Bye-bye.